The German cartographer, Mercator, originally designed this map in 1569 as a navigational tool for European sailors.
The map enlarges areas at the poles to create straight lines of constant bearing or geographic direction.
So it makes it easier to cross an ocean.
But
Yes.
it distorts the relative size of nations and continents.
Are you saying the map is wrong?
Oh dear, yes. Look at Greenland.
Okay.
Now look at Africa.
Okay.
The two land masses appear to be roughly the same size.
Yes.
Would it blow your mind if I told you that Africa is in reality 14 times larger?
Yes?
Level up your fun. Tune up. Your quest is now begun. Tune up. We'll show you how it's done. Tune up. Tune up. Tune up. Tune up.
All right, welcome to Tabletop Tune Up. As always, you're joined by Mark Lehman and my buddy Ben. How you doing, Ben?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
Not too bad. Hey, Ben, you just started up a Traveler game.
Oh my gosh, I finally got it off the ground.
Can you tell me a little bit about this dream of yours to play Traveler?
Yeah, I mean, science fiction has its attractions that are very unique and distinctive. And so Traveler was kind of one of those old school games that's been around forever, but then recently it's had quite a renaissance under Mongoose Publishing. And so we are actually not just playing Traveler in its kind of house setting of the Third Imperium. We're actually playing the 2300 AD variant, where we're the first humans that are sort of working our way out into the galaxy, and it's very early in the period. So this specific campaign is even a little bit of a variant of that. We're going out with the very first humans that are moving through space in faster than light travel.
Man, I tell you what, as we podcast here, and as weeks go by, I do want to check in to see how that game's going, because as a player in it, I'm finding some of the stuff kind of interesting. We haven't really gotten into a whole lot of like action-y elements where we can really see the kind of the grid of the game and how the dice interact with those things. So I'm excited, but I think it might be something to kind of come back and talk about the system and what things we like about it.
Yeah, I definitely think that's in the offing. So
I'm excited to see where it goes, though, Ben. I really am. So
I'm looking forward to it. Well, this week, we're not talking about science fiction as such, although that's always one of the tools in our bag. This week, we're talking about maps. And maps are important in Traveler. They're important in your fantasy game. They're important in just about everything. And there's all kinds of different maps you can make. But you know what we're not going to do? We're not going to teach you how to build maps. This is not going to be a class on geography, meteorology, astronomy, or if you're planning on mapping cities, like urban planning. We're not going to do that stuff. But we're going to tell you what you need to know about your maps in order to have a great game.
And if you listened in our last episode, our interview with GM Randy, he started with his entire game. That was the first thing he did, was build a map. And I think in our episode on religion, I thought, hey, you could start with religion or you could start with maps. You could take your pick. I went ahead and started with religion, but mapping is a wonderful place to start your game creation.
That's right. So this is part of our overall world building series. And yeah, start with this episode, start with the Powering Up Your Pantheons episode. Either way, you can use those on your way to building your own world. So Mark, where are we going to start this week?
Well, I'll tell you what, as we always say, we want to start big. Oh, wait a minute. We don't really say it like that, do we?
No, we usually say start small. So
well,
should
how about
we start
this?
big with maps?
I think you kind of want to think big. You want to start big. So you want to do like your draft. You want the general scope and size of the realm. You don't necessarily have to detail it out a high amount. We'll call this a low resolution. So we're going to start big, and we're going to kind of get the general mass.
Big land masses and shapes and sort of the gross features, as you would say, and then not so much super detailed place names and cities and economies and all of the things. You could really go down a rabbit hole with that. But just as everything else, you don't want to throw work away. And your players aren't going to be all over every part of the map. Not every part of the map is going to be as significant to them. So just include the detail you need to start where your players are.
And you want to expand as you go. So if like you want to get running with your game, you want to zoom in on that area that your game's going to start and just kind of work there. You could kind of pick at it as the weeks go by, as you start filling your imagination, your ideas, and the kind of factions that are going to inhabit this world?
Let's talk, Mark, about what makes a really good map. And so there's a few different points we want to make. The first point is good maps need to support every kind of adventure you're going to want. A map is the context in which you're going to play your whole campaign. So if you've got ideas for all kinds of different encounters and different locations, make sure your map has a reasonable way to bring all those things together in some kind of a sequence.
Yeah, a good map will support your adventure. It'll support the type of story you want to tell. A great map will not only support your story, but your other players' adventures to come.
All right, so when we're thinking about what a good map looks like in, let's say, fantasy settings, superhero settings, science fiction settings, to support all of these different kind of adventures that we want to have in them, maybe the first thing to say is fantasy maps, Mark. What do you need to make sure is on a fantasy map if you're going to support lots of kinds of adventures?
Aside from the fantastical elements of a typical fantasy map, that you want it to accommodate any modules or adventures that are in your head. So if you have a particular module you want to run, let's say you're going to run Curse of Strahd, you'll
Right.
need an area that resembles that module, right?
Somewhere you can get to a Barovia.
Yeah, exactly. So, think about this types of adventures you want to tell. And if they include modules, think about where you're going to put those modules. Ben, talk about real quick how superhero cities, because I feel like when we're talking about superhero games and a lot of modern games, the city is maybe more important than the realm, right?
Well, I mean, we remember from reading comic books and seeing, let's say, the Christopher Nolan movies or others,
Mm-hmm.
like the city is very much its own character. It's a part of the superhero story. And
Mm-hmm.
so, when you're thinking about, well, wait, what about a superhero city? If I'm doing that, you need cities that have all kinds of neighborhoods that are run down. They need neighborhoods that are upper crust. They need downtown districts. They need industrial districts. They need that port where, things are going to get smuggled in and out. They're going to need all these kind of standard things.
You need lots of shipping crates that you could pick up and throw,
That's right. The perennial warehouse. They're going to need zoos and train station parks, all
Yeah.
kinds of things. So those are the kind of things you need to start thinking about with respect to a city. And as always, there's a lot of great resources out there.
They're kind of almost like sets that you want to have for
That's right.
action set pieces, So
Yeah, what's interesting is a city is different from a fantasy map in mainly the sense that you don't have to travel as far for things to happen.
that's true.
So
What about
uh,
science fiction? How do we accommodate for how is science fiction different than some of the other ones?
science fiction is interesting because most of the time we have these kind of planets as these atomic units, right? Like you
Mhm.
have basically a planet, a space station, or some sort of interior space, and then you've got your ship. And those are the kind of three archetypal things you're going to experience in a science fiction setting, at least the kind of space opera ones we think of.
It's also kind of interesting when you think about like some of the classic books and movies and stuff. Tatooine is all you know of Tatooine is this kind of like dust bowl. I mean, as far as I know, that the whole planet's like that. I don't know if that's the case, but that's all I gather from Star Wars. Hoth is just a giant iceberg, right? I mean, is it anything else? I don't know, but it feels as though planets are an environment, right?
Yeah, it feels like a lot of science fiction settings have planets being like one single kind of biome. And so
It's so
y-
weird.
unlike Earth, right, where we've got a bit of everything, and so
Yeah.
that means we can do any part of it. I think part of that, though, right, is that when you look out at the forbidding nature of the universe, you're either too close to your star, or you're too far away from it, or
Yeah.
there's a narrow band of conditions you might think under which you can experience life. So there's a lot to think through with those, and there's a lot of great generators out there. If you're looking at Traveller, if you're looking at other science fiction games, they'll have a lot to offer with respect to generating these things at random. But the point about all those is having a map in those cases is not really needing to map a whole planet, but it is needing to map points of interest. And maybe this is a good time to bridge over to that point. So good maps need to support every kind of adventure you're going to want, and they need to have good points of interest.
Yeah.
So I wanted to introduce you to this concept I learned from a friend of mine. He was telling me about Walt Disney, and Walt Disney used to walk his dog. And what he would do is he would keep the dog attentive and following him around with a hot dog, a weenie, he called it. And so when he came to develop the parks, the Disney parks, what he would do is he would put what he called a weenie in every one of those parks. So if you're in Disneyland and you're in Main Street, you look down the end of Main Street and you see the Enchanted Castle. That's the Winnie. That's going to draw you further into Disneyland. When you're looking back in the day at Tomorrowland, you can see this rocket ship in there. You'd want to go see what that was, and it would draw you further in. And so just like there's those concepts in the theme parks, we also need to make sure your maps are drawing players into those places that are interesting and that just by the sight of them on the map, you go, oh man, I want to go there.
The weenie concept.
That's right.
Okay.
How do we generate
Okay.
these, Mark? Like, let's talk about this in terms of what it is that makes points of interest. If you're thinking about how to make points of interest,
Man.
what do you look to?
I mean, you got to think about what causes the geography to be what it is. Could it have been a major flood? Could it be, a god coming down and throwing a lightning bolt? A meteor could have hit. All these things could have history. They should have history. Like something like the Grand Canyon. There's a history there. Why did this thing form? Same thing is with your game. When you look at these fantastic places you want to put in your realm, you want to make sure to include some history to it. Give it some thought, because that'll make the entire experience more rich for your players, and they'll feel like they're in an actual living, breathing world. And that history combined with your imagination is going to create some wonderful stuff.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think about like the Great Wall of China, for example, right? An amazing thing you might see on a map, a very specific moment in history for a very specific reason. Also, there's the mythology of your world, right?
Yeah.
What stories do people tell about why it is that the world is the way that it is? Are those mountains over there the bones of giants? Is that really the spine of the ancient god that makes the spine of the world? I don't know. But these
Yeah.
are the mythic elements you can start with that help people make sense of their world and the way its features come together.
Yeah, and it just adds some beauty to it, some lore. I was thinking about a stay I had up in the Pacific Northwest at this place called the Sleeping Lady Lodge, and we were wondering why they kept calling this the Sleeping Lady. Well, we would look up at this mountain range, and it was the silhouette of a lady, sleeping. And so that's why they drew that name, and it added kind of a neat mythology to that little region.
First point, you need to support every kind of adventure you want. Second point, figure out points of interest. You want to draw people in, use the history of your world, use the mythology of your world. And then think about travel for a minute. What's it like to travel around? How do people travel around? Something to think about is that the more effective the modes of transportation you have, like in a modern setting or a science fiction setting, you can travel across the world quickly. That means that all of the places between your starting point and your destination are going to pass in a flash. It's going to be less important for you to detail those because your players aren't going to spend any time with them. So make sure that you are thinking about what kind of travel there is when you're thinking about how much detail to put into your world.
And that travel, that journey, it should be interesting. What's that route going to be like? And keep in mind that this may not be the first or last campaign or group to travel this exact same route. So if you make a boring route, you might want to think about how to liven it up for future games.
Yeah, that's a good note. Don't neglect seafaring. There's a lot of really interesting things you can do with waterways, with travel across oceans and seas by ship, river boats, all of those kinds of things. That can accelerate travel and it can help you move quickly sometimes. It's also something where if you think about the sea as its own kind of adventure, there's a lot of great underwater adventures you can do
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of ways that you can use the sea as a risk and a hazard all on its own.
Yeah.
So let's now think about superhero cities too. We talked about superhero cities before and how they need to have all these different kind of zones and locations and settings for these kind of encounters that you might want. When you're thinking about the superhero city, there's a lot of interesting stuff about travel there because remember, superheroes travel fast all over the place. And so it's important there to think about how everybody else travels. What are the mass transit routes like? What's traffic like? The reason that might be important is because I think every superhero movie I can remember seeing in recent memory, somebody's got to stop a bus, somebody's got to keep a plane from falling. The plane catch is kind of your archetypal Superman moment.
Yeah.
So having those travel modes in mind is a really good idea. And of course, remember the superheroes also have sometimes their own special travel methods to move around the globe. They might have Quinjets or rockets or whatever they have.
Yeah, poor Hawkeye.
That's right. He's going to just run. What about science fiction? Mark, what about science fiction travel?
Yeah, science fiction is also interesting too. You got to think about all that empty space. It can't just be empty space. There needs to be, navigational hazards, nebulas, cosmic, entities or things they need to avoid, or maybe there's just territory that's dangerous or something like that. Think about that area. Think about those spaces and why people might take different routes and stuff. Don't just neglect because it's space. There's interesting stuff out there, folks.
I think Traveler and Star Trek both did a pretty good job with the amount of time people have on their hands as they're traveling around. The other thing I would say is I think you need to sort of think about what kind of travel you want. And if you really do want it to just be like, yep, we're moving from planet to planet, and that's what it is, then that's fine. But you want to make those choices consciously.
And think about like Firefly, that Reaver territory, like
Oh my
how
gosh.
nail biting that was. Them creeping slowly through this territory. They knew it. They had to get through it,
That's right.
but it wasn't safe. Hey Ben, as a person who loves language, what are your thoughts about naming conventions?
Two thoughts. Yes, I love language. I love etymology. I think the guy to study here is obviously Tolkien, who loved languages. He invented languages. I don't think you have to invent languages for your maps, but think about the names, the naming conventions, the kinds of cultures that might have produced those names and languages. And so you want to try to fit your names to that to evoke the kind of pictures that you want to make in your players' heads. Because names, maps, all of these things that we're doing, they're about spurring the imagination. We need to be careful about naming also because it's very easy to make homonyms for words that are going to make your players giggle and make fun of those names and so on. So
It's not that dissimilar from naming your NPCs. You got to be careful, folks.
that's right.
Your players are, at the end of the day, they're all junior hires who just they devolve into this laughing at your names. So be
That's right.
careful.
They're going to do it. So don't make names you're going to regret.
Yeah.
Well, Mark, you've also kind of, speaking of names and cultures, you have a little bit of a thought here about cartography and how that's really something that people make and cultures make.
Maps are made by people, really. Cartography and what kind of people made these maps in the world that your players want to see. So they might be incomplete in that thought. Maybe it's the map that you present to the players may be incomplete. You might have your own behind the scenes kind of map. And that's kind of like, I guess, one of the pro tips is to have a player map and then have a GM map. You want to have those two to play between.
It'd be interesting, friends, listeners, if you go look at the maps around your house, if you look at the maps in your book of the world that you're in, what country is in the center of the map? That tells you a little bit about where the map was made. And that's kind of Mark's point, I think.
When we're talking about that player map, that can also be used as a convention to kind of tell stories. As we kind of, heard at the very opening of this episode, they're talking about a map and how the size of Iceland is way too big. Why is it drawn so big? So there could be stories in relation to that could be fun to play with in your map as well.
Well, and like we said, maybe there's lots of maps people make. You can do maps that look more like they're parchments and drawings on those parchments as opposed to kind of a big journalistic looking atlas like you might get out of National Geographic, if that's still a thing. I'm not sure. Uh, anyway, the point is there's a lot of approaches to how you give that information to people.
Yeah, and guys, as GMs out there, don't be afraid to ask your players for inspiration. A map is a lot of space to fill. I would assign each player maybe once a week. I want one point of interest that you would add to my map, and they could throw out ideas. You could learn a lot about your players in this way too. What type of games they like, what kind of things they might like. I found in a game that my players were all really kind of gravitated toward like a Harry Potter-esque kind of world, and I was like, maybe I'm running the wrong type of game for these guys.
Yeah. I had a similar experience recently where I realized that the kind of the vibe of the group wasn't really related to maps, but gosh, once this kind of clicked into place and I learned that the vibe of the group was really going to have a great time in the Feywild where you could kind of be a little more whimsical. Things kind of took off in that last game session.
What kind of things are we going to avoid?
Yeah, let's talk about that. What kinds of things are we going to avoid? Well, first thing is over detailing. I have to confess, I got some map software at one point and I thought, oh, I'm going to make a world. It's going to be so great. And I went down the rabbit hole and I just started figuring out everything to do with climate cycles and geography and geology. everything. And I realized after, several hours of this with no map in sight that I was like, I'm working too hard here. This needs to be a fantasy map that people need for storytelling. It doesn't have to be climatologically sound.
What do they say in Tolkien, Ben? The map isn't where the adventure is, or something. I can't remember the line.
Well, yeah, there's a bit that Gandalf says to Bilbo when he's trying to, he's kind of chiding him for being kind of old and fat. And he says, I remember a hobbit that used to go outdoors and he used to know that the adventure was not what was on the maps, but it was what was out there.
Yeah,
So,
you fell into that trap.
I might have. So I think another thing is to say is don't answer all the questions on your map. That's kind of the corollary of over detailing, right?
Yeah.
Don't get into it more than you need to. Leave some ambiguity for the players. And any other notes?
Oh, Ben, I was just going to say, if you did fall into that trap, you're in good company, okay?
I expect so, yeah.
Bilbo is right there with you, so.
Well, okay, so Mark, let's say we're going to do all of those things. We're going to avoid those things. Don't make a boring map. That's an important thing to avoid too. But then once you're going to sit down, you're going to make this thing. What kind of resources do we need to think about?
I'm not the most knowledgeable on all this. I know of a few. I've used a software called Incarnate, which I thought was quite wonderful. It was fairly easy to use. I think it was web-based. But you used Campaign Cartographer, have you not?
I did. I actually drew a Curious map with Campaign Cartographer, and it's really good. It's one of those kind of software packages for this that's been around since the 90s, and they've improved it over time. I'd say give that a look because you can make not just all kinds of maps, but all kinds of different style maps.
If you're lacking in inspiration, I can recommend a website. I think it's called the Cartographers Guild. You could probably Google it. It's just a really inspiring website because you see these people who've created their own homebrew maps, and maybe they've run recreations of some of the literary works, and just the artistry is inspiring, and it should get you inspired too.
Well, the other thing to do is also to take note of real life. What we know about maps and how they work has a lot to do with what we see in the real world. So use the real world to inspire you. Think about places like the Grand Canyon or some of the great cities that are really old cities in Europe or in Asia, in all kinds of different places.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't tell me Devil's Tower isn't magical. So,
That's true. Well, Mark, I think we are on to our tune-up segment for this week.
Our friend Captivator sent us a question. She asks, how do I plot adventures? I'm working on a lighthearted mystery game that should be a bit of a lark, but I'm starting to take the task more seriously and plan out how the encounters and the NPCs are going to work. What advice can you share with me?
The mystery thing can be great or it can be a slog. A lot depends on how you parse out information to your players. The way that you're going to parse that out, of course, is over time. So the first question is, how many sessions is this going to be? It's going to be like a one shot in an evening?
Yeah.
Going to be 3 or 4, sessions? What's it going to be?
Yeah, that's a good point. I got to be honest, Ben, I don't have a lot of experience running a mystery per se, like a legit mystery. Like, I've run games which had elements of mystery in them. But when I think about like mysteries, yeah, that pacing is really important, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, think about the rate at which people are going to get information, how they're going to get that information, what stunning moment is going to happen when the lightning crashes and all of a sudden we realize,
Yeah.
wait, that was the diary from the so-and-so or the special locket that so-and-so had when they died or whatever it might be.
Yeah, it's kind of like that roller coaster. You want it to kind of go up and down at that right moments so it can reach the heights near the end.
The other thing to do is think about the NPCs, right? Agatha Christie's great at this, and this is where we want to borrow from the tropes of the mystery genre novels. NPCs all need to be fleshed out and be credible with respect to whatever the mystery is about. If it's a murder, then you need to have more than one credible murder suspect who could have done it.
Yeah, that is exactly why. If you only have fleshed out one or two NPCs, the players are really going to think like it's got to be one of those two.
Right.
So
yeah.
it's
But
important.
How do we know it's not so-and-so?
Exactly. Yeah. If you think about like the movie Knives Out, it's kind of like a bottle episode. Every one of those characters is fleshed out for that exact reason because any one of them could be the murderer.
Yeah. So I'd say look to pop culture for the education on this, and I think there's a lot out there. Agatha Christie, Sherlock Holmes, so many great resources to dive into. And of course, players are ready for that, and they're super interested in playing out those tropes. So, Captivator, thanks again for your question. That is our tune-up segment for this week. Mark, any other thoughts as we wrap it up?
No, I'm good. I'm content. I hope everybody has a great week, and we'll see you next week. Okay.
Sounds good, everybody. Until then, keep those dice rolling.
Level up your fun. Tune up. Your quest is now begun. Tune up. We'll show you how it's done. Tune up. Tune up. Tune up. Tune up. Tune up. Level up your fun. Tune up. The quest is now begun. Tune up. We'll show you how it's done. Tune up. 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 Level up your fun. Tune up. The quest is now begun. Tune up. We'll show you